So, you don't have to give me a name or anything, but could you introduce?
Don't mind.
Oh, that's fine then.
Hi, yes, I'm Rebecca Garside. I'm a Senko curriculum lead, teaching and learning lead, and I've worked both in the UK and internationally in Tunisia and Malaysia.
Okay. And can you tell me what they think dyslexia is in Tunisia, what they think it is in Malaysia, and what we think it is in Britain? Is it the same thing, in other words?
Yes and no. In Tunisia especially, there is really not a lot of awareness about dyslexia at all. So in Tunisia, you have French schools, you have English schools, you have French schools, and the local schools. French schools and British schools have more of an awareness. Mm-hmm. Probably British schools are the best ones for recognising dyslexia, okay. But the local schools really not so much at all. And to be honest, I think a lot of teachers just really don't have any awareness of it at all. Children, they just assume children are lazy.
Okay. And you say they assume children are lazy, and what about the children themselves? Do they believe themselves to be lazy, or how do they react to that, essentially?
Yeah, so I think it does a lot of the time become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think the children get frustrated. I think it's very difficult for them. And it's also difficult for parents because the parents really don't have any awareness either. And so it's kind of very difficult. Parents try to get extra tuition for their children, but then what tends to happen is the children are kind of flogged all day at school, finding things really, really difficult. And then they get home to another hour, 2 hours of kind of private tuition to try and help them to catch up. But that's delivered in exactly the same way as it is in school. So it really has very minimal effect.
I don't want to generalize, but I mean, I'm going to ask a generalizing question, so forgive me. I mean, what do you think it is about the culture or the society in Tunisia, which means that people don't recognize it? Is it simply that news hasn't yet spread there, or is there something else going on?
I think quite recently they wrote about dyslexia in the newspaper, and that was a huge step for Tunisia, a huge step for Tunisia. But I think another problem is it's kind of, there are educational psychologists that diagnose it there, but psychologists come with a stigma. So even people who have mental health difficulties, they don't want to go and see a psychologist. So if it's raised with a parent that you feel that their child would benefit from an educational psychologist assessment, you very much get this, no, not my child. Psychologists come with this stigma attached, which is very difficult. Working as a Senko there, it was very much, I was told I have to be very, very careful how I talk to parents about, any concerns that I have about their children. And that's even in an international school where things are much more widely accepted.
So in general, you'd say that in Tunisia, getting a dyslexia diagnosis is almost a socially negative thing. It's a difficult thing for a child to have or for a parent to accept.
Yes, absolutely. And like I say, very little awareness of it. So I think they assume that if you're saying that their child might have dyslexia, then essentially you're telling them that their child is stupid. So, they have this, no, not my child. I don't want my child labelled as that. There is kind of very much that kind of stigma attached.
So as a Senko there, I mean, what kind of battles are you fighting? I mean, you want to help people, but people don't want to be helped. They don't want to accept that they need the help, or what's going on?
So I think in the international school that I worked in, parents were much more accepting, and Tinika, who was Senkoing out there as well, she arranged, she's originally German, but married to a Tunisian, and she got a lot of expat parents together, and they actually flew in a dyslexia assessor from England to assess a load of the children out there, and they kind of shared the cost of that between them. But obviously then there is a huge wealth gap there, because there is that kind of awareness, that kind of ability to do that and willingness to do that, but that's kind of only for the people who can afford it.
So can you talk about that wealth gap? So the people who can afford it, that is an assessment costs a lot of money and people don't have that money. How much does it cost? What's the dynamic of that?
So obviously flying a dyslexia assessor in from England has a significant cost attached. But most of the children from less affluent families, they're all in local schools, and the awareness in local schools is nil. So it's not even really something that they really consider or really think about much.
Yeah. And does that compare with Malaysia, for instance? So you say you've lived and worked in Malaysia, and Malaysia is a different sort of kettle of fish, as it were.
Yeah, I would say there is a lot more awareness in Malaysia, but probably a lack of accurate information. Interestingly, so I did actually consult with my friend Priya out there, who's still out there. She is Malaysian herself. Her sister is a play therapist, and she works in mainland Malaysia, because obviously my experiences of Sarawak, I said to Priya, I'm very much aware that things will be different over on the mainland. And she said yes. So she consulted with her sister for me as well. So we've got some really great information as well. But she said that years ago, they actually introduced kind of standard screening kits that schools would administer in year one. And then there was like a remedial program. So between years 1 and 3, and then they would be reviewed before headed into year 4. But unfortunately, those screening kits were pulled after 5 years. So they ran them for 5 years and then they pulled them out. So I believe they pulled them out because the data suggested that they weren't effective. And I believe that might be because there are kind of 3 different types of school in Malaysia. So you have like the schools that teach in Bahasa Malaysia, and then have some English as well. And then you have the Tamil schools, and then you have the Chinese schools. And essentially the screeners were only really accurate and only really effective in the schools that were teaching in Bahasa and English. So obviously the kit itself was a standardized kit, and it didn't account for the language differences.
So they pulled it for everybody. Okay. And what's the attitude towards dyslexia there? Is it more positive?
Yes and no. So I think there are pockets. The teachers tend to be the ones to try and identify it. They tend to try and identify it when children are kind of between 7 and 9, I think. But they're looking for things like still reversing letters in their handwriting. They're looking for their sentence structure, their comprehension, essentially, and their reading skills, their fluency of reading. And then you have clinical psychologists who will make the assessment. But there is a significant lack of funding, I think, and there is still a significant vacuum of support there. They do have a dyslexia association. I'm just going to have a look because she gave me the name of it. It is the Persatuan Dyslexia.
Oh, I know it. Yeah.
There you go. And they were founded in 1995. So, but you know about that one.
They've got branches.
Is it on your dyslexia map, Martin?
Yes, it's on the map. Yeah.
And that's an NGO. They have, I think she said, about 12 centres. But again, they're kind of in those main areas, like Selangor, KL, Penang.
What kind of work do they do? I think that's... Do they support? Is it financial support? Is it education? What sort of thing do they do?
So the only part that I really know about is the support centres, that they have support centres. But definitely there's no outreach, particularly out into Sarawak. There's no sort of outreach out there. When I was working out in Sarawak, there were like 2 paediatricians that I could refer parents to. But even then, it's kind of quite difficult to do that. And where there was kind of any other issues, then parents were having to fly their children over to KL to access access kind of support and input.
Yeah. So can I ask, I mean, this isn't designed to make Britain seem great at all, because I think we've got a long, long way to go. But
we do.
When you came back to Britain, did you see an improvement in how dyslexia is looked at? Or is it very similar? Or what's the difference, as it were, between, say, Tunisia, Malaysia, and then the United Kingdom?
So I think in England, we have this kind of dyslexia friendly schools initiative where, you know, kind of all teachers are encouraged to teach in dyslexia friendly ways and more inclusive practices. But this, for me, there is still a huge barrier to that in as much as training for teachers. You know, it's not a big enough part of initial teacher education. It's not a big enough part of continuing CPD. It's kind of just an expectation that's slapped on schools and teachers without really much support. Out in obviously Malaysia, Tunisia, where there is such little awareness, again, I think there's less support to fall back on. So whereas here, teachers, you know, who haven't had enough support or education about it, there is still those places you can fall back on. There are still those resources that you know about, and you have Senkos in your schools, you know, whereas abroad, that's still really a rarity.